Streets of Fire. It was pitched as a rock and roll fable. The studio expected Grease meets the Warriors, and what they got was Blade Runner with the guitars. 40 years later, and that broken studio dream is why Streets of Fire is a cult classic. It has William Dafoe as a villain straight out of a fever dream, music written by Jim Steinman, and a young Bill Paxton popping up as a punk bartender. But it failed so badly, well, it barely made half its money back. This is a story of another time, another place. If you've ever tried to explain Streets of Fire to someone who hasn't seen it, you'll know it's not easy. It opens with a concert, smoke machines, leather jackets, crowds chanting, and then seemingly out of nowhere, a bikie gang storms the stage and kidnaps a singer. That's the setup and the whole of why we're here. Ellen Aim, the kidnapped singer, she isn't just some random girl, she's Cody's ex. Cody? Well, he left town years ago, burned every bridge on the way out. He only comes back because his sister guilt trips him into doing something decent for once, and he ain't too happy about it. What follows is basically a rescue mission through a city that looks like it had 1950s and the future had a fistfight, with no clear winner. It's Pulp Fiction in the original sense, not Tarantino's version, but the cheap old paperbacks where plot doesn't matter as much as attitude. Tough guy, kidnapped girl, and a city full of gangs and neon, where logic is optional and style is mandatory. It came out in 1984, directed by Walter Hill. By then he'd already made The Warriors in 48 hours, so Universal figured they knew what they were getting. They didn't. The hero of the story returns to his grimy, half retro, half science fiction hometown to save the girl, and then it's kind of like a comic book no ever finished writing. Obviously, with this being billed as a rock and roll fable, the music is a huge part of why this thing works, or at least why it's remembered. Annoyingly, I can't play it because YouTube would tear me apart for it, but imagine the most over-the-top 80s power ballads you've ever heard. Mix that with Bruce Springsteen's working class swagger and Meatloaf's melodrama, and you're close. And none of that is without reason. The vibe of the whole thing is inspired by the Bruce Springsteen song of the same name, Streets of Fire, from the Darkness on the Edge of Town album. They originally wanted to use the song as the film's finale, but when Bruce Springsteen learned he wasn't going to long performing it, he pulled information and Jim Steinman was brought in to replace him. It ended up giving the film two of its biggest songs, Nowhere Fast and Tonight Is What It Means to Be Young. Jim Steinman's sound is undeniable, thunderous drums, gospel choirs, and enough melodrama to fill a stadium. Every track hits you with a kind of wall of sound energy only he could deliver. Tonight Is What It Means to Be Young, the replacement song, is pure theatrical excess, and it saves the ending from just sort of stopping. And yes, Meatloaf did record a song called Nowhere Fast by Jim Steinman, but while I had the same idea and the same music, the lyrics would be different. Jim Steinman is the only reason I know of the film at all. I'm all in its Wagnerian style of music. I'm a big fan, have been for a long time. The cast only makes it stranger, in a good way. Michael Paré, fresh off Eddie the Cruisers, plays a hero, Tom Cody. He's an ex-mercenary, stoic, square-jawed, and not quite as iconic as the film wanted him to be, but he fits the tone, a guy from another time in a world that never was. He's since said that he didn't really understand the film's tone while shooting it, which might explain that slightly dazed look he carries through most of it. Interestingly, the role was supposed to go to young Tom Cruise, but he'd already committed to making Legend, so it never came to be. Amy Madigan plays McCoy, a tough, no-nonsense ex-soldier who tags along to help Cody with a rescue. She's all grit and sarcasm, constantly cutting through the film's melodrama with his deadpan, grounded energy. It's one of those roles that should have been thankless, but Amy Madigan turns it into one of the film's secret weapons. She's basically the audience's voice of reason trapped in this pulp novel. Originally, character McCoy was supposed to be male, but was rewritten for Amy when she expressed an interest in the part. It works. She's one of the few people on screen who actually feels like she's from the world Walter Hill imagined, and not just visiting it. Deborah Van Valkenburg, who'd worked with Walter Hill before on The Warriors, she plays Cody's sister, Reva. She's the emotional anchor of the story, and she doesn't get much screen time. She's the one person trying to remind Cody that this isn't just about saving a girl, it's about doing something decent for one. Diane Lane stars as Ellen Aim, the kidnapped singer. She was only 19 here, but somehow still completely convincing as a world-weary rock star. Walter Hill was reluctant to cast her at first. He'd envisioned her in her late 20s when he wrote the part. But when she turned up for the audition, she went full-on rock chick. She turned up dressed in black leather pants and a mesh top, which proved to him that she was committed to the role. He ended up being so impressed with her as Ellen, he actually wrote extra scenes for her. She's not in it a lot, so who knows how small the part originally was, but I'm glad we got what we did. She doesn't actually sing any of the songs in the film though. That was Laura Sargent and Holly Sherwood, which she fills the fantasy effortlessly. So much so that if you look at the songs here on YouTube, they're actually credited to Diane Lane by those that don't know any better. Ellen Aim's band, The Attackers, and they're all played by the band Laura Sargent sang with, Face to Face. For the film, they're credited to a made-up studio band Jim Steinman created for the project, Fire Inc. Rick Moranis plays the manager, but not the lovable nerd we know from Ghostbusters or Honey I Shrunk the Kids. Here is an arrogant, shout-tongued little bastard, constantly shouting at everyone. It's a little weird seeing him this abrasive, but it gives the film an edge it really needs. And speaking of abrasive, according to Walter Hill, Rick Moranis was a pain in the ass on set, constantly questioning direction because he wasn't allowed to improvise anything. Yeah, cranky comedian in need of an outlet. Kinda fits the role, doesn't it? And then there's Willem Dafoe. If you've never seen him in this, imagine a villain who looks like he stepped straight off the cover of a pulpy 1950s horror comic. Black leather overalls, slick back hair, and of course, that stare. This was one of his first big roles, and even then it was impossible to ignore. Apparently the leather outfit was so tight it had to be zipped up while he was already standing on his motorcycle, which is the kind of detail that makes sense for this kind of movie. Internet trivia claims he nearly suffocated in that get-up and had to be liberated with a straw. I couldn't find a single real source, just dusty old forum posts repeating the same paragraph, but spiritually, it feels true. Audiences in 1984 didn't want to make of any of it. It cost around $14 million, a lot back then, and barely made half of that back at the box office. Critics called it cold, indulgent, and emotionally empty, but over time, Streets of Fire started finding people who actually got it. Because beneath the big hair and explosions, it's a film made by someone who deeply loved the idea of being cool. Everything's heightened, the lighting, the dialogue, even the gunfights feel choreographed like dance numbers. It's a world that runs entirely on attitude. Walter Hill made the film he always wanted to make as a teenager. Everything he thought was cool. Custom cars, motorcycles, kissing in the rain while trains passed in the night. Characters that wore leather jackets bound by the honour and always willing and able to make a joke in a bad situation. And that's what we got essentially. Streets of Fire might have failed miserable in its home countries, but the Japanese lapped it up. It even won an award for Best Foreign Language Feature. It had inspired several anime releases, including some bigger names like Bubblegum Crisis. If you ever watched Bubblegum Crisis, you might think one of the opening scenes is oddly familiar, and for good reason. It's pretty much a copy of the one from Streets of Fire. Two early Japanese video games also took inspiration from the film. Final Fight from Capcom in 1989. That borrowed the look and feel of it all, and they even went so far as saying one of the characters called it. Streets of Rage from the early 90s, the visual DNA, the attitude, it's all soaked into that game as well. You can trace it all back to this film, this messy, misunderstood rock opera. Walter Hill originally planned it as the first part of a trilogy, The Adventures of Tom Cody. But the box office takings killed that idea overnight. Decades later it did get a sequel, kind of. Road to Hell. It's a film that's been bandied about for a few good years now. It's never had an official release, but you can find it if you know what to look. It's, well, not what you might expect. It's a low-budget independent thing directed by Ulrich Pigon. And if you know that name, you know what you're getting. And if you don't, and decide you want to know more, then buckle in for a bumpy but interesting ride. Michael Paré returns as Cody, or a version of him. Deborah Van Valkenburg is back as his sister as well. And, you know, I said Streets of Fire was hard to explain, but Road to Hell, I don't even. I'll make a video on it at some point when I know what to start. It's interesting, another time though, yeah? But 40 years later, people still care enough about this old broken gem to bring it back. And that's the thing about cult films. They don't fade away, they just wait until the right people find them. Streets of Fire ultimately failed because it was never cared about being realistic, it just cared about being cool. It was never trying to be timeless, it was trying to be mythic. And I, for one, believe it achieved that. For all its chaos, its weirdness, and all the choices that make no sense, it ends up meaning something to someone. It won its audience one at a time. People like me who showed up for the music. People like you watching a video on the internet about it all 40 years later. It's what cult films do. Films like these, they don't need to make sense. Sometimes films, they just need to feel like something, and Streets of Fire does. I don't know what it is. What I do know is that Walter Hill promised a rock and roll fable, and love it or hate it, that's exactly what he delivered. Anyways, I've been Paul, and Streets of Fire was cult, actually. If you like this video, then do me a favour and drop me a like and let me know. Subscribe as well if you want, either. Or don't, I'm not going anywhere. And I'll catch you on the next rewind. Thanks for watching.